Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Inoqo webinar. My name is Hélène Sauret, and I will be your moderator today. So the topic of today is Mastering Sustainability Metrics in Grocery Retail, your comprehensive guide to Scope 1, 2, and 3 in the grocery industry. So you have probably heard about all the upcoming regulation coming now in Europe, especially the CSRD, starting in 2024. Already the companies, European companies, will have to report on the possible social and environmental impact of their business activities. And one of the first steps that company will have to do is to understand their emission, and sort them into 3 categories: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So to help you understand the topic, I have brought today 2 experts. The first one is Alexis Normand. Alexis Normand is the founder and CEO. Yes. So Alexis Normand is... Sorry. Yes, so we have Alexis Normand, founder and CEO of... Or Alexis, you wanted to introduce yourself?
Well, I think by now people know that I'm the co-founder and CEO of Greenly, and indeed we are a carbon accounting platform today serving more than 1,000 customers, many of them working in retail. And so I'm very excited to be here today and discuss this great topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. And together with Alexis, we also have Markus Linder. Markus is an experienced impact entrepreneur, an impact investor, and a serial founder. He has been active in the startup scene for over 15 years. In 2006, he founded his first startup, Zuwu, and scaled it to become a global market leader, securing over $200 million in venture capital. In recent years, he has shifted his focus to address the greatest challenge of our time, the biodiversity and the climate crisis. And in 2020, he founded his second company, Inoqo, where he is now acting as the CEO. So a very warm welcome to the 2 of you. I think the discussion will be very exciting. It's an absolutely hot topic at the moment. Maybe if we quickly go through the agenda. So the agenda for today, maybe next slide. Exactly. So I have already introduced the 2 panelists and also said maybe a few words about the topic. We will start with Alexis, who will explain us what are Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and why they matter. Markus will then deep dive into Scope 3 emission and why they are in particular important in the grocery sector. And he will also talk about the upcoming EU regulation, in particular the CSRD, and how it impacts the grocery retailer. We always have time at the end of the webinars for a Q&A session, so I really encourage you all to use the chat of this webinar and just shoot your question at any time. If you want to target a particular speaker, if you have a question for Markus or for Alexis, also feel free to just name it. And I will make sure we have time to go through all the questions. So without any further ado, I would like to give the word to Alexis. Alexis, go ahead. Alexis, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks. So in short, Greenly today is, our headquarters are in Paris. We're a 4-year-old tech company, and our vision when we started the company that we'd soon be entering a world in which everyone, 100% of companies, 100% of people would need to track their carbon footprint. I come from the quantified self world. I used to be in a company doing smart watches, and people were making fun of us when we said everybody would be tracking their steps, and now it's on every phone. And I think it's pretty much the same with carbon footprint. And the situation requires it because, only about 25% of global emissions are being tracked and managed. and it needs to go to 100%. So what the reason we founded Greenly was to essentially build tech to make that tracking scale. Part of it is by streamlining the data collection and analytics for companies. Part of it is by essentially making it simpler and more intuitive for people who are only just starting their climate journey. So we target SMBs and mid-market companies first, and we take them step by step through this journey so that they can produce essentially a audit grade, regulatory compliant GHG report. And it's not just to take a picture of your emissions, but really to identify the hotspots, figure out which action plans you could put in place, and also start tracking your progression over time. So I'll pause there just to not to anticipate too much on what we might be saying later on. You're on mute now, Hélène.
I think you have.
Oh, I've
Yeah,
anticipated.
I'd like to continue maybe through your slides.
Okay,
yes.
sure. So I may have anticipated a little bit. So why is all of this very important? As you know, if we don't reduce our emissions, essentially the current historical path would get us to a world where the concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions would essentially lead us into a world of 4, even potentially 6 degrees Celsius increase, which comes with a lot of natural disasters and population displacements and basically catastrophes that we want to avoid. Now, what the Paris agreements outlined in 2016 is that it's actually possible to reverse course. I mean, this huge increase of emissions is actually rather recent, right? It started with the Industrial Revolution. And so it laid a path, right, inspired by the work of the International Panel on, Climate, IPCC, which says that it's a very ambitious track, but we can get to net zero by 2050. Net zero means there are as many emissions being released in the atmosphere as there are those being captured. So we're always going to be emitting, but we have to reduce drastically those emissions, and in the meantime scale whatever carbon sequestration we can right now. So the priority being reduction. It's super hard to reduce anything if you're not actually tracking where you are. And 20 to 25% of global emissions are being tracked essentially by large companies, and they were used to tracking essentially part of their emissions, but now this has to concern the entire supply chain. So I don't know if I have So what are we talking about exactly when we talk about tracking emissions? So there are several standards around this, but the more established one is typically around the defined by an organization called the GHG protocol, Greenhouse Gas Emission Protocol, and it aggregates emissions into 3 main buckets, right? And it's very important to have this comprehensive view, because when you hear companies declaring their emissions, sometimes claiming carbon neutrality, if you look into the details, you realize that very often they're not necessarily tracking all those different categories. So what are these categories? Number 1 is scope 1. Scope 1, very simple, and sorry if people already know this, but it's your direct emissions. So it's anything that's being released out of your own facilities or vehicles. So it includes, the carbon dioxide out of your company-owned cars. It can include the refrigerating gases from your air conditioning in your offices, or whatever fuel or gas is being burnt by your machines if you own a factory or some production means. That's scope 1. It's the basically emissions of what you own. And now, of course, you're powering your office, you're powering your company-owned cars if they're electric, you're powering your electrical machines. And so the electricity that comes through the grid does, for its production, does release emissions. And so if you're plugged to a grid, that's your scope 2. Scope 2 is essentially the emissions linked to your energy consumption. And of course, if you're, say, in China and most of the energy mix is coal, it releases a lot more GHG emissions than, say, if you're in Norway, where there's a lot of hydroelectricity, or France, where there's a lot of nuclear energy. So you can measure this to scope 2. And then there's scope 3, which is essentially the largest single category. So it's basically everything else. But I think talking with Inoqo today, that's probably what we're going to be most interested in, because whatever your company, 80% of your emissions or more tend to come from your scope 3. Scope 3 being, when I say everything else, it includes things like what you buy and sell, right? Your supply chain, if you're a retailer especially. It might include employee mobility, travels. So if you take the airplane, the emissions are with, Lufthansa or Air France, but it's still linked to your work. It's your commute. It's the usage of your product. If you're selling iPhones, people are plugging them in to your emissions. It's the end of life of these products, etc., etc. And when we talk about retail, it's usually around scope 3 that you have the largest single source of emissions. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alexis. On my side, I don't see the slides anymore. Sarah, maybe you can try to refresh. But I'm very interested. I was very particularly interested to know that only 20% of the emissions are being captured at the moment. I thought it was more. And it really shows the importance of having platform like yours, Alexis, and also platform like Inoqo, because 20% is really nothing. And there is no chance to reduce emission if you haven't calculated them before. So this was really, this was very insightful. Thank you. If you want, maybe Alexis, show us through your platform, maybe just the next 2 slides, and then Markus will deep dive into scope 3 emissions and why they matter.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the way that our platform typically works is we, let me actually show maybe another slide that works, but essentially it's all about data collection and producing the right sort of data. So in just a few words, I'll explain this. Here you go. So Sarah, I might share my own slides. I think there's a very important concept here to understand is, so here you go. Can you see my slide? So I think just to understand the fundamentals of carbon accounting, it's all about tracking the activity metrics of a company. And you can, so typically in those scope 1, 2, and 3, I want to know if I take transportation, I can track this in different ways. So I'm saying, hey, I'm using a lot of freight or using a lot of cars. So I can look at how many gallons of fuel I've burned. I can look at how many miles I've traveled, or I can look at how much money I've spent on, buying fuel. And of course, it's more accurate to get close to the physical quantities, right? So if I have the gallons, I can be super precise on kilograms of CO2. So this is the fundamental principle. And now you look at all the scope 1, 2, and 3 categories, and you take every single subcategory, and then basically you collect data, and then you use a conversion metric, an emission factor. And of course, that's a lot of data. So one of the ways that we do this efficiently is that we connect to different company softwares to track their emissions. So for a spend-based approach, we might connect to accounting data. Say you're a tech platform, we might connect to your AWS consumption to figure out how much data center instances you're using and how much electricity that's consumed. Or if you're a retailer, we might connect to your Shopify account to get your SKUs. So basically, we pull data from many sources. There's some we pull data from utility bills, and we automate this computation of getting the activity metric and translating it into emissions. And I think you can look at it as a simpler version is say we upload accounting data, we compute employee emissions, we track company data, and then based on your vertical, we'll do a deep dive. So a deep dive might be around, and I'll finish with this. If you're a company, maybe a retailer with a lot of facilities, you have buildings, say you're, I don't know, a big retailer like Nike, and you have buildings all across the Europe or the US, you have a lot of buildings and you want to compute your scope 2. So what you essentially want to do is you want to track the electricity consumption of your different facilities. So one thing that you can do is you can upload this information actually automatically by having the facility manager of the company link its different utility accounts. This allows us to track in near real time the electricity consumption, on an hourly basis. And now electricity is typically something for which a kilowatt hour has a given quantity of grams of CO2. So for instance, the average kilowatt hour in a country like France is 50 grams, but in Poland, it's 600 grams. And in Ireland, it's 300. But of course, this metric changes over time because according to how much sun and wind there is, the grid is balanced out to have more or less gas or coal. So renewables are typically fluctuating in terms of output, and you use non-renewables to compensate. So you have a changing carbon mix of electricity. And so if you can get real-time energy consumption and combine it with near real-time carbon intensity of electricity, you get something super accurate. Why does it matter to be that accurate? Well, because if you have that level of analysis, you can actually basically decide when to consume energy or where to consume energy. So the granularity allows you to make better choices. And I think I'll end with this, but this principle that I've just explained is true across many different dimensions. It's true for cloud computing. You can decide where and when to use it. It's true of anything where the emission factors changes over time or over geographies. So that's a crash course in carbon accounting for our listeners today.
Thank you, Alexis. We had maybe a bit of trouble with the connection, so it was cutting a little bit, but the slides are very self-explanatory. So we just covered mostly scope 1 and scope 2, so the emissions that are directly done by the company itself or slightly indirectly. Now we have scope 3 emissions. So the scope 3 emissions are the emissions coming from the product itself. And excuse me, they are very important in the grocery sector. And I would like maybe Markus to explain us why they are so important in the grocery sector and what are the challenges around them.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be part of this webinar. Thank you very much for organizing it. And Alexis, thank you very much for already giving us a great insight into the magic of scope 1 and scope 2. And many of the things that you mentioned are also in particular true for scope 3. Maybe let me first quickly introduce Inoqo to you. So Inoqo is a software as a service platform that enables grocery retailers to assess and manage the sustainability impact of the tens of thousands of food and beverage products. So we are assessing food and beverage products on impact dimensions such as carbon, obviously, but we go beyond that. And we are fully 100% focused on the food and beverage grocery retail sector. Let's go to the next slide, please. So Alexis already mentioned that a very large part of the emissions in retail arise from scope 3 emissions. In the grocery retail space, it's actually even more extreme because in the grocery retail space, typically 93% plus of the emissions come from the famous scope 3. So it's basically the products that you find in a typical grocery retailer that are responsible for a very large part of the emissions of a grocery retailer. And at the same time, retailers today have no scalable way of collecting the data they need to really calculate the emissions more accurately. They have very limited resources internally to do that. There's still a huge amount of uncertainties with regards to methodologies, consumer behavior, and there's no other industry like grocery where there is such a huge amount of variability in terms of data than in food, because it makes a difference where you source your tomatoes from, at what time of the year you source them, how that tomato was produced. So it's a very interesting and very demanding area to really assess the scope 3 emissions. On the next slide, yes, Sarah, we can see that what we do with Inoqo is we have built a technology that enables grocery retailers to assess their tens of thousands of food and beverage products, private label brand products, as well as third-party brand products, starting with the data they have available today. So we get started with the public product data they have today, like the ingredients, like the nutrient values, like the labels. And we have built an AI-based technology that enables us to accurately estimate the composition of each and every food product. So we know how much wheat goes into ready-made pizza, how much tomatoes are on there, how much tuna is on there. And then we assign conservative emission factors for consumer communication and supply engagement onto all the ingredients and all the processes that go into the production of a food product. So you showed Alexi earlier on that slide, this move from spend-based emission tracking down towards activity-based tracking. And this is basically what we do here in a similar way for scope 3 emissions for the grocery products, by really being able to assess the products in detail while taking the ingredients, the composition, and the processes into account. We can do that for private label brand products as well as third-party brand products at scale. And as we assess products initially with conservative values in the absence of primary data, we at the same time create a strong incentive for the suppliers to provide us with more and more primary data over time. So if we don't know where the wheat of the ready-made pizza came from, we don't just choose an average value, but we choose a conservative value, and that creates a strong demand from the suppliers to provide us with more and more primary data over time. On the next slide, we can see the science behind our calculation. Basically, we assess products from cradle to grave, so our customers see where does the footprint come from? So what's the footprint of a product at farm stage, at production stage, transport stage, storage, and so on. And actually here in the transport, storage, and retail stage, you can see how we can integrate with Greenly, because what we ultimately do here is that we use the data that Greenly can basically capture from a retailer to make the product level assessment more accurate. So Greenly is doing an amazing job in understanding what was the energy use, for example, at the stores of a retailer, or what was the fuel-based emissions due to the transportation from a warehouse to the stores. And based on that more accurate data, we can then update the product carbon footprint of a retailer's food and beverage assortment. On the other hand, obviously, we can integrate our data into Greenly's platform so that grocery retailers have a better understanding of their scope 3 emissions seamlessly integrated into their carbon accounting platform. Maybe important to mention here, we assess or we provide two data sets to our customers. We basically provide a scope 3 product carbon footprint reporting value. Here we use primary data wherever available. So if we know that a certain ingredient was sourced from a certain country, we would use that value. But in the absence of primary data, so if we don't know where a certain ingredient came from, or if we, for example, don't know what type of electricity was used for manufacturing a certain product, we use average data for reporting. However, for consumer and supplier communication, here we use primary data wherever available plus conservative data. Why do we do that? Because our customers use that data to communicate the impact of products towards their consumers and towards their suppliers. And we want to avoid greenwashing by all means. We want to avoid that, the majority or half of the products on the shelf get a better product carbon footprint than they actually deserve because of using average values. Yeah, now we can proceed to the next slide, please. So what does this look like in our platform for our customers? Customers now see what is the product carbon footprint of a specific product, like in this case, a hummus. They can see what life cycle stage contributes to which extent to the overall footprint of the product. And they can also identify hotspots of that product. So where do the emissions actually come from? What are the processes that generate most of the emissions? What are the ingredients that generate most of the emissions? And obviously you can only improve what you can measure, and you can only improve where you know in detail what are the hotspots, and this basically lays the foundation for improving further down the road. And we also provide so-called impact insights. So we do not only assess products from a quantitative point of view, meaning we provide our carbon footprint value, we provide a rating, like a label from A to E, that educates consumers whether a certain product is rather climate friendly or rather, climate intense. But we also explain the why behind the products. We explain why a product has a high product carbon footprint. We explain that a certain product, maybe for example an organic product, was for sure produced without animal feed, that includes soybeans from the Amazon rainforest and has potentially caused deforestation there. So really providing the whys behind the impact of a product is a very important feature to our customers. Next slide, please. Yeah, what can our customers do with that data? Obviously, a key reason why retailers, and now I'm not seeing the slide anymore, unfortunately, Sarah. It's a key reason why retailers invest into the solution is obviously to be able to report in a more accurate way. So being able to use that data to report, and we will hear a bit more about that shortly. But another key topic is to really ultimately enable consumers to change their behavior towards more climate friendly and more sustainable products. So this can be, for example, praising consumers for climate friendly purchases, on the checkout, when you scan your loyalty card, sending them a push notification, hey, well done, this was a very climate friendly purchase, because you're now going to participate in a raffle. You can win back up to 200% of your purchase that you just did with us, because that purchase was very climate friendly. Or this data enables grocery retailers to actively recommend more climate friendly, more sustainable alternatives from within their own assortment. So you can scan products at the shelf and you see how is a product performing, but you also see more sustainable alternatives recommended to you. And very important, it's not just about really providing information and data. If you want to touch your consumers' hearts, and if you want them to transition towards a more climate-friendly, more sustainable, and also healthier diet, it's all about leveraging content, nudging, and gamification to take them along onto that journey. So we use here, or our grocery retail customers can do challenges like, hey, try 2 plant-based milk alternatives this month. If you do so, we're going to reward you, and many more tools and solutions to really take consumers along onto the journey. Next slide, please. So why does it matter to get more granular? Getting back to what Alexi mentioned earlier, this transition from spend-based approach towards really more activity-based approach measuring. Why is this also very important when it comes to Scope 3 emissions? So what grocery retailers today are primarily doing, they are basically assessing their Scope 3 emissions based on category averages, which typically means that every dip at the shelf gets the same average product carbon footprint. Every pizza with meat on it gets the same product carbon footprint, irrespective of how much meat is on that pizza, whether it's beef or chicken, and many other factors. And that makes a big difference. So for example, when we look at typically ready-made pizzas, you have a difference between 2 to 3 kilogram for vegan or vegetarian options, and more than 10 kilogram for meat-heavy and dairy-heavy options. And obviously, the biggest problem for our retail customers is that they committed to carbon reductions, and that CSRD is basically forcing them to report on their carbon emissions and forcing them to report on their scope 3 emissions, and they need to show to their investors, to their employees, to their customers that they're making progress. And the problem with this approach, where they use basically category-based averages, is that they cannot make progress because all of their dips, all of their sauces, no matter whether full of meat or full of vegetables, will always keep the same value. In contrast, with our technology, we can really take the ingredients into account, take the composition into account, take the production processes into account, which means our customers can benefit from the steps their producers are taking upstream and gradually reduce their scope 3 emissions. Because as soon as a supplier switches to green electricity in their plant and feeds that data into the Inoqo platform, the scope 3 emissions of the retailer go down. As soon as a supplier transitions to deforestation-free ingredients, the product carbon footprint of the products goes down and the scope 3 emissions of the retailer go down. So it's really, basically as a retailer, you don't necessarily need to start with this level of granularity if you just want to report. Yeah, you can do that based on average data. But latest 1 year later, you're in deep trouble because you will basically see that you couldn't really make progress in terms of your reduction, because you still have consumers, buying more or less the same products they've purchased the year before. You just benefit from a few of them transitioning to more vegan products. But ultimately, yeah, you need this kind of granular product level approach if you want to go and really make progress. Next slide, please.
I think from what I could hear from you, Markus, and from Alexis, so granularity does matter. It matters for the reporting, but most importantly, for the reduction. If you don't know exactly where your emission comes from and how it came from, you can't reduce it. So that's why it's probably for no matter what you're measuring, scope 1 or 2 or 3, granularity does matter. And it is difficult to gather all the data, but it's really super important also in the long term if you want to really have an action plan how to reduce your emission. And this brings me to the next topic, which I think it's very important and very related to what we were just discussing, which is the CSRD and the upcoming EU regulation. We hear from different customers that it really creates a lot of tension and question how and when, and is it really important, and am I affected? So maybe Markus, since you talk to a lot of retailers and brands, can you maybe just say a few words about this, not going too much into details, but how will it impact the grocery industry?
Yeah, I think it's on top of mind of probably every one of our listeners anyway, so I don't think we need to go into details, and I don't think we need to explain what CSDDD and CSRD are about. There is a big push towards this EU Green Deal, which requires the grocery retail industry to first of all disclose their impact on nature and to ultimately act upon the impact on nature. And this really increases pressure that goes beyond, because now it's beyond voluntary disclosure and it's beyond voluntary commitments. Now our customers are really seeing real life impact. For example, the German grocery retailer Rewe, one of the largest German or largest European grocery retailers, just secured a 900 million green bond. So they lended 900 million in capital, which they're going to invest into their green transition. And as part of that bond, they get more favorable terms, so a lower interest rate, provided that they can show that they're making progress on their sustainability commitments, making progress on their sustainability goals. So investors are rewarding companies that are transitioning to more sustainable products and more sustainable offers. And this is really what companies can see now.
If I may add a few things about CSRD, so it's an EU-wide regulation that will essentially move the number of companies required to report from about 10,000 to about 50,000. There are a few big differences from the previous situation. So it's not just the number of companies, it's a phased in. It starts with companies above 500 employees, and it phases into companies above 250 employees or with 40 million turnover. But on what needs to be reported, it used to be that you had a lot of local regulations saying report scope 1 and 2. And now you will have to report your scope 3, at least what is considered material. So materiality, is a concept borrowed from financial accounting, which means something you need to disclose to your investors because it has a material impact on your valuation, so to speak. So in the case of carbon accounting, it means something significant, to put it short, to say it short. And so in the case of grocery or retail, what you had until now is that most retailers were not reporting their full scope 3. And if you look at a company like Amazon and you go and read their sustainability report, you'll find out that they're not reporting their scope 3 related to marketplace suppliers. So essentially, they're emitting more than 90% of their emissions. So under CSRD, they need to start reporting this. And while they are an American firm, they have more than $50 million business in the EU, and they have more than 500 employees in the EU. So the CSRD essentially will push as an extraterritorial reach, meaning it will push companies, big retailers, big grocers, to start reporting their scope 3. And what this essentially means is that companies like Amazon will start asking their suppliers for information about their own footprint. Because if I'm Amazon and I need to report my emissions linked to my marketplace, and basically I can make a number of assumptions on what is the footprint of a screwdriver or a phone or whatever. But then, of course, if you actually want to reduce, as Markus was saying, you need to figure out down to the level of the ingredient, or the supplier. So you've got to be asking your top suppliers what they are, and so they're going to start counting. So it essentially has a ripple effects, trickle down effects that are absolutely massive, and it's not just an EU regulation; it's actually a global regulation because it will affect supply chains everywhere in the US, in Asia, and so on and so forth.
And Amazon is a great example because Amazon just got kicked out of SBTI, so the Science Based Target Initiative, because of not, showing a path towards net zero, and that obviously brings quite some reputational damage along, which shows how important it is for retailers to really not just set targets, but also put the right platforms and the right methodologies in place to collect scope 3 emission data in much more granular way, and to be able to really make progress.
Perfect. I think, Markus, you have just one more slide about very top level recommendation for the F&B sector, and then we have already a few questions that we can go through.
Yeah, I think what we are seeing at the moment, that it's really crucial that the food and beverage grocery retailers and in general the food and beverage sector shouldn't be scared. Obviously, you need to make sure that you avoid greenwashing, but you should also avoid to fall into the trap of green hushing, not talk about the good things that you're doing. I think we're all on a journey. If you do that based on a scientific approach, a solid approach, that's the way to go. It's really important that you, even if you don't talk about, latest now start to assess and optimize your products. Grocery retailers have a huge lever, especially with regards to their private label brand products. No matter whether communication to consumers is right away on top of mind, now is the time to really start understanding what are the hotspots of my products, what can I do about it, and start working with the suppliers to step by step transition products to, become more environmental friendly. We think now at the moment, it's not the time to commit to a specific, let's say, impact communication label. I think now is the time to really focus on finding the right approach, identifying the right approach, right solid methodology that's ideally shared by many other players in the industry, and really select the technology that can then potentially generate different labels in the future, and especially stay on top of the regulatory environments that are happening here within the EU. There is not only CSRD coming up now, there's also obviously the Green Claims Directive around the corner. This will still take 3 years based on our contacts at the Commission, what they're seeing or expecting at the moment. There's also the sustainable food labeling framework coming up. So there's lots of regulation coming here, but now is the time to really get moving into the right direction, be prepared. Last but not least,
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to add something. The regulations are one thing, but what we're seeing from a lot of our customers is that the more proactive they are on this stuff, the more business they do, because there is essentially this huge movement of shifting from less sustainable to more sustainable brands. Consumers are looking for it, companies are looking for it, and so if you're able to substantiate the claim that you're actually a better alternative in terms of emissions, in the short term, it materializes by through an increase in market share. And I think there is this general idea that the energy transition is against business, and it's true that some sectors will need to scale down, the oil and gas industry mostly. But what we observe is a lot of companies are now putting products on the market, and they expect growth because it's sustainable. So we don't see necessarily regulations as being anti-business. It's actually probably actually an accelerator of the alignment between business and sustainability objectives. And to me, it's really the only way to scale the tracking, but more generally the energy transition.
Totally agree with you on that.
Great. I think we come to the end of the slides, so we'll go through the question. The very first one was for Alexis. How do scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions differ, and why is it so crucial to understand and report them separately? And what do you exactly need for each scope? So you said some of this in the webinar. Maybe you can summarize it.
There are basically no companies who have exactly the same activity. They differ, they are organized differently, more or less things are outsourced. So if you don't want to, it doesn't, one way that companies look at how they are doing is by comparing themselves, right? And so if you compare the total emissions of a company versus another, it doesn't really mean anything, because even if you compare Samsung versus Apple, they're in actually very different businesses, right? Some have a lot of digital. So you need comparable metrics, and you need to compare apples with apples and carrots with carrots. So having said this, I think high level, you absolutely need to be comparing subcategories which are in themselves comparable. If you think about something like scope 1, how much basically emissions do I have for my direct operations? Then you can, within scope 1, you have a category which is called mobile direct emissions. So it's maybe not a very sexy name, but it means the emissions from your cars, basically, or your company-owned vehicles. So then you can actually look at, on a per dollar basis, if one company is better than another, right? Because, and it tells you, actually, I'm late electrifying my vehicle fleet. So scope 2, energy consumption. If you compare 2 retailers, you can look at, are my buildings energy efficient? So a lot of the scope, housing tends to be between 25 and 35% of emissions of any given country. So it's basically transport then housing, if you take the pie chart of a country. And then retail, food, is about 20%. But so housing, it's scope 2, so it's the electricity. So you have what we call the indirect emissions linked to electricity, and within you also have the indirect emissions linked to steam, because you sometimes have municipal heating or stuff like that, which is shared among buildings. But so in electricity, when you have this, you can compare your own buildings. What's the electricity or the carbon footprint per square footage? And then you can compare your building against the national or the regional average. And what this tells you is maybe you're consuming too much electricity, maybe your buildings are not isolated, and so on. And then in scope 3, which I say is a broader category, you have goods and services, you have freight, you have waste. So this is an area, the whole point of tracking is to take these areas step by step and then figure out how detailed you can be. And for each one, do action plans. And so this mapping allows you essentially to not just to understand, but for each sub category to access basically a growing knowledge base that's actually quite shared of action plans within each category. The energy transition is not so much a problem of knowing what needs to be done. Everybody knows what needs to be done. We need to basically electrify everything and make every source of energy low carbon. To put it very simply, that's what the IPCC report summary in 2 sentences. But to be able to do this, you need to break down this idea for each sub category. And so it's super important to have, like in financial accounting, specific accounts that you can compare to. And then the other advantage of this is that you have template categories per sector. So typically, tech companies, all tech companies, their biggest source of their emissions is their scope 3, and it's always their data center and cloud. So you always know what the remedies are. Grocery, it's always the purchase of goods and services, basically, plus the transportation, high level, etc. So you can templatize things, but to think of any problem, you need to categorize it. So I'm sorry if this is too long an answer, but here's a quick overview.
The devil is in the detail, Alexis. So we like long answer. We just said before, granularity is key. So granularity in the answer as well. Maybe let me jump on the next one because it's a little bit linked. So we just talked about before about granularity. Markus was talking about the importance of going to data at ingredient level. And I heard it's pretty much the same also for scope 2 emission. And you even wrote in your answer, the more granularity, the more options to decarbonize. I have a question for both of you, but maybe let's start with Alexis. With all the clients you're working for, are suppliers willing to share their data?
No, so great answer. You can always make some hypotheses about suppliers, but to be really good, you need to have information down to the supplier level. When we were talking about ingredients, you have an average emission factor for a kilogram of tomatoes. But actually, within tomatoes, you have the ones that are grown under greenhouse. You have the ones, through electricity. You have the ones that are imported from very far. You have the ones that are in the right season. So you have categories, right? And then you have the individual supplier. So it's a fractal thing. You can always go one level deeper. But now, when we're thinking about grocery and Amazon, for instance, asking its supplier, so they're going to go down to that level. And so the question is, can you get the answer? So this is a feature of our product. We help our customers track their scope 3 with more accuracy, more granularity by requesting more info. What you see basically is that the suppliers will answer if they have done it. They would be very proud to say so, and that might be 5-10% of SMBs who can boast that they are, actively tracking their emissions and reducing them. And then you have that remaining 90%. And so here they will be engaged and they will answer essentially depending on how much constraint the customer puts. So if you're an SMB engaging your supply chain and you represent maybe 10K of revenue for your supplier, chances are he won't answer. But if you, on the other hand, have how can I put it? If you're a big company, if you're a big car company and you say, I'm going to buy 1 million pieces from you every year, and I make this a requirement for you to give me this, well, then basically it's a life and death thing for a supplier, and I guarantee they will answer in this case. So so that's, I think, it's a carrot and stick thing. If the stick is very big, suppliers answer, but it's also a carrot thing because once suppliers understand they do more business by being greener, they don't need to be constrained. And so you need to architecture systems that give credit to companies for being greener. So you need companies like Inoqo to make them stand out in front of retailers. You need us at Greenly to make it visible to our customers who is doing good and who doesn't really care, and so on and so forth. So I think the architecture of IT systems in showcasing who is good and who is not, there's this big data and knowledge base that we have to build, which I think can make a lot of difference and certainly what motivates us to improve the product every day.
Yeah, maybe to comment on that from my side. So it's definitely a challenge. So what we see is that in the grocery retail space, there's multiple challenges. The first challenge is that, if basically producers don't really want to share insights regarding their supply chain, regarding their recipes with the retailers, because they're scared that a retailer would just take their recipe and then bring their product onto the market as a private label brand product. On top of that, they're afraid that the better a retailer can understand their supply chain, the more pressure they can put on them in terms of pricing, right? Because the better you understand where the ingredients come from, the better you as a retailer understand, okay, what's the margin of the player? So this is one important challenge that we are solving by enabling the producers to share their insights and their data with us, without us then passing on all the secrets to the retail customers, but we really then pass along the results of our assessments without sharing trade secrets with the grocery retailer. That's one very big challenge that we are solving here with Inoqo. The other big challenge that we are seeing in the market is that retailers or the producers and the food and beverage brands are today asked by all the different grocery retail customers to fill out different reports with different formats that all kind of surround about very similar data. So there is a big need for having one platform that collects data for multiple retailers in a unified way and then pushes it out across the suppliers. And that's obviously something that we can also solve. And where I totally agree with you is that it's absolutely key that grocery retailers put the right carrots and the right sticks in place so that producers start to provide more and more data over time. And let me start with talking about what I mean with providing more and more data over time. What we've learned, what doesn't work, is if you go to your supplier and tell them, okay, I now need a full LCA and all kind of data about all of your products, because they're simply overwhelmed, especially the SMEs. And when I talk about SMEs in our context, even companies with, between 1 and 5 billion are struggling to really follow along on that transition to more sustainable products. So you really need to enable the producers and empower them to provide in tiny little baby steps more and more information, guide them from one hotspot to the next one to figure out, okay, how is this product performing? And this is exactly what we do. So we enable them to step-by-step provide more primary data to us. In the first step, it's just, hey, what's the country of origin of the sesame seeds within your hummus, for example, which already allows us to replace, conservative data and potentially enables us to reduce the impact of that product significantly. In terms of the carrots and sticks, as you said, it's about retailers need to provide more sustainable brands the opportunity to stand out in front of the customer. So, for example, recommend sustainable alternatives within the app, within your online shop. It's all about giving sustainable brands like additional marketing opportunities, like give them access to maybe screens in your stores where they can advertise and promote their more sustainable products. But it's also definitely about putting the right sticks in place. In our context, some of the grocery retailers are communicating to their producers that they're going to delist 5% of the products within each category where more sustainable products become available in the category. And that obviously incentivizes, creates a very strong incentive towards the producers to look into the sustainability of the product. That's bad.
No,
you can't hear me anymore?
I still hear him. Yeah, I can still hear you.
For a second, I couldn't hear him. Sorry.
Okay. No, but that's basically a summary. So it needs the right, definitely needs the right incentives and the right sticks in place and the right model and right platform to get more.
Can you hear me though? Just to be clear, because
we can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Yes. So just until Markus comes back, and sorry about the technical glitch. We're seeing the end of the webinar coming. So, I think what's exciting is the level of transparency which we are consumers are expecting on this. It is driving brands to change. And to me, it's a game of technology lowering the cost of making things more transparent. Inoqo and ourselves are two examples of that. And so it used to be that asking for so much transparency was not feasible, but we're essentially now at a point where it's really super feasible. The tech exists, so it's almost a crime not to do it. So it has essentially raised the bar for everybody on this. And so to conclude on my end, it feels like concepts like scope 1, 2, and 3, which are maybe new to a few people right now, will essentially be just common knowledge for everybody. And in the same way that you ask about a company's turnover and benefits and so on, is it a good investment? You say, okay, but what about its scope 1, 2, and 3? It'll be one of those things that those concepts that were kind of remote and are going to become extremely mainstream. And the reason for that is we have no choice. Otherwise, we're facing dire global warming. So it has to become something everybody's thinking about all the time.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Markus. We are at the end of the webinar. So thank you, Alexis, for the closing word. And sorry a little bit for these technical issues that we had here and there, but the topic is really very interesting and it was a great discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Hélène, for setting it up, and Sarah as well. So bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks from my side. Bye.
Bye-bye.